Hello, everybody. My name is George Kors, and today we are talking about Mahmoud Darwish's العصافير تموت في الجليل, The Birds Die in Galilee, a beautiful poetry collection by a famous Palestinian poet. But before we dive into everything that I've got to say about Mahmoud and that wonderful collection here, if you like these videos, you want to support me, please buy my new novel, Sing Lazarus. Link and everything is down below. You guys know that I'm a writer. You guys know that I do this professionally. So if there's anything that you want to do to support me, interact with my literature is the best way. Sing Lazarus, my new novel that came out in June. You can buy my debut from all the way back in 2015. Always the Wanderer. Available. Everything down there below. And thank you to everybody for doing that. So let's get back to El Tamut Fil Jalil, The Birds Die in Galilee from Mahmoud Darwish. Um, Mahmoud Darwish was a Palestinian poet in the 20th century, very prolific, relatively famous, although I don't see a ton of translations of his work. But if you're interested in getting to know a little bit more about maybe Arabic language poetry, maybe more contemporary Arabic language poetry. Maybe if you've been looking at world news and thinking about, wanting to learn a little bit more about maybe Palestinian culture or the culture in Palestine, maybe, exposing yourself to Mahmoud Darwish would be a good idea. And before we really delve into this work here, and I'm just going to talk, a little bit about the poems in this book. And I've had some discussion of poetry on here. We've had some poets on to discuss their work. All that's linked down below, of course. But before we get there, there's some backgrounding that we should talk about with regards to Mr. Darwish in regards to being sort of oriented in that Palestinian cultural space. And one big thing that we should talk about, leading into this is the really, really long imperialist and colonialist history that is present in a place like Palestine and is present in a place like that entire sort of Western Asian and Northern African region, which, folks might refer to as the Middle East. I tend to skew on referring to these regions as Western Asia and Northern Africa because they're largely diverse, and although they're unified by the Arabic language itself is hugely diverse. The dialects are extremely complex, and going from a place like Palestine to Saudi Arabia to Egypt to Morocco, you're going to experience like such wide ranging and diverse cultures and expressions of the Arabic language. So for that reason, I steer clear from that. But we just should sort of orient and recognize that there is a longer, imperial history and colonialist history here than a lot of people talk about, and it goes, much further back than U.S. American and Israeli interest. Pardon me, in the area. And goes back, of course, to the British and the Ottomans before them, and that is really just us talking about the last 200 years of that region. And I would, as a person who has studied, imperialism in Western Asia and Northern Africa, it's important to me to sort of recognize and foreground right now the role that the British have played, and an ongoing tradition there of European colonialist imperialist power exerted in that region. And to examine the poetry of somebody like Mahmoud Darwish, for example, it would be a disservice to your own readings to do so without foregrounding and understanding some of that history there. Um, you know, I think it is really important for us to sort of grapple with that, especially if we're U.S. Americans reading that, especially if we're Europeans reading that. You might look around and, go to your local bookstore, for example, and you might realize that there is not a whole lot of Arab literature there, even in translation. And that has a lot to do with a much larger and longer historical tradition that our countries have played part in. And I think I'd reference Homi Bhabha here and say, to recognize the cultural hybrid is to recognize the sort of complexity of identity and culture. and to divest ourselves from nationality, for example, is a good way to counteract hegemonic power. Okay, maybe that's a hefty sentence. Maybe it's not, but that is just my way of saying that, by understanding the complexity, not by attempting to understand, attempting to recognize, let's take understanding out of it, by attempting to recognize the complexity of a person's history, of their cultural history, or their linguistic history, that I think adds a layer or multiple layers of nuance to our readings in a way that is really, really cool. And Darwish as a poet, is beloved. Of course, a really, really influential poet. And there is, moving on from the sort of, hey, there's a lot of history here, which I think hopefully goes without saying, but I would recommend looking into that more. Um, Darwish as a writer really has this bridging the gap um, quality to his work, where Darwish uses more traditional inherently rhyming styles of Arabic poetry early in his career, and then later transitions into free verse. And I've seen some scholars talk about, the sort of third world desire for modernism, and how, we might see folks from, Western Asia or Northern Africa, for example, emulating, European styles with a desire to be cosmopolitan. And perhaps that is true, but I think what is interesting about Darwish here is all these histories, all these long lines and complex ideas coming together through his work. And looking at his work, and looking at the Arabic language, and looking at the poems that are rhyming and do have that more traditional style, and looking at his poems that have a more free verse style, is a really, interesting way to delve into a person's cultural complexities, and the sort of, um, influences and pressures that they feel as a writer. What drew them to the more traditional form, what drew them to more maybe Eurocentric forms, if we'll permit ourselves that. All of this is really, provocative for us to consider as readers, and it's something that I think is owed to a poet like Mr. Darwish, because you know, as we consider just the, like sort of unending complexity of the, contemporary self as a person in this, global world with all these different powers and pressures and histories and ideas all intersecting in a human being who's writing poetry, it's, really complicated stuff. And for that reason, I think, looking to Darwish, and understanding, that intense tie to a homeland and a culture and a language, and seeing, just how complex that all gets, when we realize that, as individuals, we exist with each other as opposed to alone. Um, and I think the cultural hybridity thread here is really important to me with Mr. Darwish. As I was going through the poems, and working through them, and just trying, my best with the Arabic to get in as much of this as possible. I kept coming to this, this feeling of being pulled apart in different directions. There is a little bit of that, modern versus traditional thread in here. But I don't want to overplay that, because there's some other aspects of the work that I'm going to get into that I think are maybe more exciting to explore. Um, and I will just start off, talking about the poems by saying, right away in the first poem in this collection here, you know, there is just such a really interesting connection, and a beautiful line that really was provocative to me. And this first poem um, here is called Lahu Ale al Jadar. And it has a line in the first stanza here, Wa al Ha'it Tabki Hiroshima. Um, and and the wall cries Hiroshima. And I really went into this expecting, some really complicated commentary. I think any poet worth their weight is really um, casting out some really complex social commentary and historical commentary, and Darwish is, no exception to that. Um, but right away in this collection, which was published in the Arabic in 1969. That's right after 1967. That's right as these complex ideas of pan-Arabism and all sorts of really complicated intersecting cultural ideas, expressed through the Arabic language, are shifting in monumental ways. Um, in this first stanza, to reference Hiroshima is a really profound acknowledgement of human violence and this tendency towards violence on a grand scale, and it really does call us into a really serious and somber sort of mode. And I'm gonna actually, I found a translation. I found a few translations here. Um, I found a translation of this first poem, "Painting on the Wall," and I will link down below for you folks. And the two translations I'm going to share, I just want to highlight them here. They're both from Luke McMahon. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his last name right, and also if my Arabic pronunciation, my apologies. But Luke has provided a few translations on ArabAmerica.com, and they're looking pretty good, having read through them. And one thing that I'm liking about this, and I would encourage folks to interact with my edition only has the Arabic, but my encouragement to folks out there who might be interested in this, if you can find a dual, a bilingual edition, it's a really good idea, and it's a really good idea to get that. And one of the reasons why I say that is because in the ethics of being a reader, I do think it's a really good idea to expose yourself to the other language that maybe you don't know or you know very little. And this might sound glib, but my honest encouragement would be to, if you've had any Arabic, just read it in the original Arabic as best you can. I understand that that's a daunting task, and I understand how difficult it can be to find works in the original Arabic. But just bear with me on that, and please take that encouragement seriously. But fortunately for you, both the translations that I'm providing in the link down below have both the original Arabic and the translated English. And just seeing this call to Hiroshima right away, it really is rather poignant. Um, and that brings me to a second poem that I want to highlight here for you all. And this is a poem that I was not able to find a translation of. And if I do find a translation in the interim, I will post it down below. And this poem is called Matar Na'am fi Khif, pardon me, Baid. And this is sort of a fine or soft rain in a distant fall. And I'm going to let that title just sit for a second. This idea of a soft rain in a distant fall in the past. Um, the themes that we get in here are very, very soft often, and there's a little bit of a profound contradiction for me in calling to Hiroshima so early on, and then looking at the sensibility that Darwish brings in most of the poems here. And I would include the title poem, العصافير تموت في الجليل, the birds die in Galilee, which is also a poem that is linked down below. That's the second one that I'm linking to. There is a very tender sentiment to me, and I think that is one thing, that is difficult to read for, when we're, especially in poetry, but generally, it's very difficult to read for, the kind of feeling, I think people would call it the vibe that is there. It can be difficult to assess that without a lot of cultural um, you know, fluency. Let's use fluency there, maybe, or cultural awareness. Um, and you know, there is in Darwish's work a little bit of that, softness and gentleness. And I've never been to Palestine. I have lived in Saudi Arabia, and I can say, they're very different cultures, of course. But a culture that I might have experienced there was a gentle, caring culture, and that sounds really contradictory given the Saudi Arab government. But it should be said, that there is a little bit of that, almost nostalgia, almost a little bit of homesickness throughout it. And it doesn't come off necessarily violent. What is happening there with Hiroshima is, we're seeing the violence done onto others, by, the US in this case. And that's a really provocative image that's repeated throughout that first poem, the painting on the wall that, really gets us in that mode there. But then we see, this contradiction with a person, having this soft longing um, that I think is really, really provocative. And I thought it was really, really, you know, to say, just really sad and poignant, and really, very well done. Um, the title poem here, العصافير تموت في الجليل, also is just really, really excellent. And the collection itself is very short, and throughout it, um, we really see, Darwish doing a really excellent job of, building these portraits in a multifaceted way of, not somebody who's resentful or angry, but anger, yes, but somebody who's really profoundly reflective. And that I think is a really complicated, that's a really complicated way to parse through this longer imperialist and colonialist history that I was talking about earlier. I think one thing that Darwish is really good at is just constructing this image that is, just a gentle image of, you know, um, a bird in the air or a clothesline or something, that you just feel, really captures that sense of longing and that sense of belonging that a person can experience and feel. Um, and at the same time, there are many instances throughout the text where you get the sharpness of that colonial or imperial experience, where you get a lot of that punch that's there, and that can be really cathartic. And I think what is really great about this collection, I think Al Safir تموت في الجليل is really good because it has that multiplicity of experiences where you're seeing, on the one side, the very fine sharpness of an experience of power, that is power exerted onto self, right? And then at the same time, you're experiencing love or nostalgia or feeling of just a gentle longing. There's a poem in here, about somebody being in jail, and just that multiplicity is so present in all of the works here. It really, it really is fine, fine poetry, and I think obviously, Darwish is pretty well known. I think probably in the United States and Europe, he's relatively well known. But his work deserves more attention, especially for the fine quality that he works in there. And I think fans of 20th century poetry, for example, if you really are somebody who fancies yourself an enthusiast or a poet, and the 20th century, U.S. Americans or European poets are right up your alleyway, I think it would be time to visit somebody like Mahmoud Darwish, who exists outside of that, in response to that, in connection with that, and to remember that cultural hybridity that I was talking about there, where while Darwish is Philistini, he is a Palestinian, and he is that through and through, and is a voice of Palestine. he's also existing in a wider, global, gigantic world where all of us are exerting those powers or feeling those powers or reacting to those powers. Pardon me again. And that's really, evocative and beautiful stuff. And I think Darwish deserves a place, without a doubt, in your sort of, list of 20th century poets. Some general themes that I point to in The Birds Die in Galilee that I, would recommend you look out for if you're going to be taking a look at the poems down below, or if you are going out to get a copy of this. Um, First and foremost would be language. Throughout all of it, Elura is just such a really provocative and interesting theme. And we see, Darwish referring to language in really complex ways. And I loved that throughout it. That was one of those things that I kept coming back to time and time again. It's just looking at how Darwish was thinking through language was really provocative. This next one I've already talked about, longing, that feeling of homesickness. I'm rereading Homi Bhabha right now, and Homi Bhabha refers to a Freudian concept of unheimlich, but this unhomely feeling, that place that, if you're that feeling of liminality, of being in a liminal space, it's really interesting. And I would say, really provocative. The next one I would say is really, this I think is important, on a larger sort of macrocosmic scale as well in Darwish's work here, and that is a connection to Greek thought. There are a lot of allusions and sort of comments on ancient Greek thinking and philosophy, throughout this, and mythology to an extent as well, and there's like a reference to, I believe, Athena and other sort of textual commentary there. And that is, I think, really important. And there's a reason why I would highlight that. In my experience with Islamic thinking, and in my studies of Islamic thinking, I think that there is a connection to Greek thought, and there are certain scholars, Islamic scholars, and scholars of the Arabic language that bear and carry a connection to ancient Greek philosophy and the Greek thought tradition, the ancient Greek thought tradition, um, much more than, say, Western Europeans have. And that is something that I think would be really, I would be more interested to explore that, personally, to sort of delve into that. Um, because I think that there's a big sort of intercultural, scholarly exchange that is, very, very old, and continues that ancient Greek thought tradition from, these Mediterranean areas, around Greece and Turkey, and then, into Western Asia, Northern Africa. I think there's a lot to be explored there. And that's something that just kind of piques my interest, that I would be interested in looking at. Um, then I would say one of the sort of the images that we see all the time, is just this concept of the small land, and it's, I don't necessarily want to evoke the sort of biblical David and Goliath feeling, and I think some folks will, but there's just, a feeling of, this little place is his, it's theirs, it's a, cultural sensibility, and even though it is tiny, it is, such a, a warm and sentimental and important place. And I really like that, that use of, this small land that comes up throughout the poems here. And a part of that is because, in 1969, when this is written, we're talking about basically the height of the Cold War, and we're talking about two big lands kind of fighting each other in these really obtuse ways. Sending a man to the moon, they destroying Vietnam against each other for some reason. And all of this, you know, giant machismo of the 20th century, of these big countries, and not only, geographically big, but also just big in terms of their outsized influence. And then to see, somebody really valuing the small country, and that sort of contradiction, against those big countries. And that's, that's me. That's my reading there. That's my, sort of interpreting what Darwish is doing with that. And I found it actually very clever. The last little set of themes I would say would be interesting for someone to explore here might be nature versus modernity. There's a lot of natural images, just even in the title poem, these birds, and I think if you know if tradition versus modernity is really your thing, I think you could get some stuff out of Darwish, and I think the best way to do that probably would be nature versus modernity. Um, it's not necessarily my thing to like delve into those eco criticisms, but it could be something that's really cool for you. Um, I really hope, I just want to encourage folks. I know, if we look through here, I know that, the concept or the idea of attempting to grapple with texts that are not in letters that you recognize is really tough. I just want to encourage you out there to like try it and give it a shot. I really do think it's more tenable and more reasonable for you to learn to read something like Arabic or Chinese or South Korean or whatever, Bengali, whatever it is you're learning. I think it's more reasonable for you to learn that if it doesn't use, Roman characters than you anticipate. And I just want to encourage you out there to, give it your best. And it really is an enriching experience. And I know, you might be an Arabic student out there, you know, looking at a poem and just saying, I don't recognize any of this, what's going on here. And that's okay. Just take a deep breath. You will get there. It is definitely worth your time. It's definitely worth the effort to sort of recognize and go through. Because one of the things that I love about reading in Arabic is that you're experiencing a different culture and you have no choice but to experience that different culture because they're using, this script that is not something that I grew up with, for example. That's a really beautiful act, and I think it's well worth your while. And I think if you're interested in, the literature of Palestine, or you're interested in Arabic language literature, I think it's well worth your while. And I hope you at least go through the two poems that I linked down below. I'd like to talk about a few recommendations. Um, I have three recommendations from one writer and one from a second writer. And the three recommendations I'm going to talk about, I'm just going to talk about them in passing, are from Agha Shahid Ali. And Shahid was quite a prolific and beautiful poet from the Kashmiri region, and I recommend this selfishly because I know a member of Shahid Ali's family. And I just want to recommend Ali's work here. Not because they have any connection with Arabic or Mahmoud Darwish, but because they have a connection with this sense of longing and this really complex sense of self and feeling that I see a lot in العصافير تموت في الجليل. So first off is Call Me Ishmael tonight. The second is Rooms Are Never Finished, which has some really beautiful poetry and was a National Book Award finalist. And the last is my personal favorite, and I will read something from this right now. This is the Half-Inch Himalayas. And my edition is from Wesleyan Press. But allow me to read just a little bit from the title poem here called a postcard for Kashmir. Kashmir shrinks into my mailbox, my home a neat 4 by 6 inches. I always loved neatness. Now I hold the half-inch Himalayas in my hand. This is my home. This is the closest I'll ever be to home. Really strong and beautiful, evocative stuff here. And I don't talk a lot about poetry on the channel, and I will try to talk about more poetry, but Agha Shahid Ali is just a really beautiful voice, and I can't encourage you enough. If I were you, I would go out and get both of these books right here and just, read them back to back. And the last recommendation I have recommended time and again on the channel. I'm going to recommend it again on the channel. I will recommend it in the future on the channel. I'll be recommending it forever. Is Borderlands La Frontera by Gloria Anzaldúa. And why do I recommend this? First off, because I think, hopefully you're open and excited about engaging in some like real deal feminist philosophy. And that feeling, that sensibility of attachment to and feeling this longing for home. I felt it reading Borderlands, reading La Frontera. And one of the things that I really love about Anzaldúa's work here is that it's largely bilingual in the English and the Spanish. And I love that she writes these poems throughout the piece that challenge the philosophical form, that are bilingual in the way that they are presented. I just think that there's so much nuance and frankly brilliance going into La Frontera that I can't do anything except for say, read this, to buy these three works and just, read them back to back would be, I love doing it. I hope you love doing it too. So all that aside, I want to say thank you for bearing with me today, and my apologies for my Arabic pronunciation. I know my horrible pronunciation, and I just want to encourage you, to go out and find those poems that really challenge you. It's just a really great cultural exchange, literature. And, I think everybody who watches this channel regularly knows how much I encourage people to read challenging novels, how much I really, I want you out there to be encouraged to say, yes, I will put the phone down. I will do all this, that thing that you probably want to do in the first place. And I'll tackle this. Let's not use tack. Let's not use a violent verb. I will engage with this literature that I've always wanted to engage with. And across languages is one of the ways to do that. So, I just want to encourage you here, wherever you're at, whether that be, excited to delve into poetry, if you're, a big fan of Darwish and you've already, delved through all of his work, you're ready to go through it again, or this is the first time and you're excited and you're looking for something new, try it. It is really worth your time. And I think at the end of the day, you'll get something out of it, no matter what, angle you sort of approach this at. And what's more, reading these poets, especially in times that are so complicated and convoluted in our own present actions and relations to each other as individual human beings, but also as our, historical and societally understanding human beings. It's just really well worth your while. And Mr. Darwish is a fantastic poet, and I hope you consider his work, and I hope you consider العصافير تموت في الجليل, the birds die in Galilee. Thank you, everybody, for being here with me today. I hope that your reading and writing practices are going well. Again, if you want to support me, you can buy my work. You can buy Sing Lazarus. You can buy Always the Wanderer. Links to all that down below. If you want to learn more about me as a person, thinker, writer, you can go to my website, georgekors.com. You can follow me on socials that I may or may not be using at gbk7288. And generally, I hope that you're safe and having a good day. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.